Well, let's look to him now as we get ready to study. Lord, help us. Help us, Lord, to see the invisible by your Spirit. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, Genesis 30, verse 26. Jacob says, "Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served thee, let me go. For thou knowest my service which I have done thee. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. He said, Appoint me thy wages, I will give it. He said unto him, Thou knowest how I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me, for it was little which thou hadst before I came, and it is now increased unto a multitude, and the Lord has blessed thee since my coming. And now, when shall I provide for mine own house also? And he said, What shall I give thee? Jacob said, Thou shalt not give me anything. If thou wilt do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. I'll pass through all the flock today, thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and of such shall be my hire. So shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face. Every one that is not speckled, spotted among the goats, and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. Laban said, Behold, I would it might be according to thy word. And he removed that day the he-goats that were ring-straked and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all the brown among the sheep, and gave them into the hand of his sons. And he set 3 days' journey betwixt himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Now, in our last study, what we did is we saw how Jacob had it's done. He's finished with the 14 years of promised service to Laban. He's put it all in. He's put his time in. He's taken care of Laban's flock. He promised he would do it. Actually promised he would do 7 years for Rachel, but then he had to do another 7 years for Rachel to get his wife. But who's counting? Jacob was counting. And so is Laban. And during this time, Laban's flocks have increased greatly under the care of Jacob. And Laban hopes that, well, he's got 4 local wives from Haran. He's got 11 sons that were born in Haran. Maybe somehow he just becomes so attached to Haran that he just wants to call this place his new home and stay and continue to take care of Laban's flocks. I mean, why change? It's been 14 years. Why have a disruption what's in the routine? But that was not at all in Jacob's mind. And Jacob made this announcement to Laban, and this was the announcement that Laban was afraid of in verse 26 when he said, Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served thee. Thou knowest my service I have done to thee. That for Laban was a terrible day. It was the day he never wanted to hear Jacob say, Let me go. And so now Laban has to muster every ounce of persuasion, every argument that he can come up with to try to convince Jacob to stay. And so in verse 27, he starts and he says, If I have found favor in thine eyes. See, when he said that, if I have found favor in thine eyes, he's really pulling out all the stops, Laban is. Because what he's really saying is that, look, Jacob, if you've got any love for me at all in my heart, please stay. That one didn't work. So if that was the best that Laban could come up with, that's pretty weak. So, because Laban has cheated Jacob terribly. It's really, it wasn't a good move for Laban to pull out the "if you got any love in your heart for me" card. That wasn't a good card. So probably when Laban said that to Jacob, Laban could read, Jacob's body language, just disgust. And so Laban had to quickly come up with his next argument, his next persuasion. And so now he pulls the Lord card. And he says in verse 27, I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. See, when he said, I have learned by experience, he used a word there, which translated learned by experience. He used the word nachash. Now, nachash is an interesting word in Hebrew because that's the same word that's used in Genesis 3:1 when it introduces the serpent that led Adam and Eve into sin. The serpent's called Nachash. That's the name of the serpent. It comes from the word shiny. So it really has the connotation of a shiny one, like the skin of a snake is very shiny, especially as it slithers along, and it's shiny, and the sun attracts off of it, the sun reflects off of it, and what he does, he just lures, that's what the snake does, he lures his victim to within striking distance. You know, when we lived in Lakeside with our 300 goats around our house, you know, several times the diamondback rattlesnake would get into a goat pen, and it would slither around on the ground, and its shiny back, you know, would reflect the sun, you know, and what would happen is that there would always be a goat that just said to itself, I got to go see what that is. And it would become attracted to it, and it would go investigate, and it would get closer, and it got within striking distance, then pow, just like that. We didn't really see that part happen, but what we found when we went out the pen is there's the goat laying on the ground, panting, his neck's all swollen up, and he's panting for air, and eventually he dies after a few days. But it's that shiny allurement which is used to get the victim within striking range. That's the root of the meaning Nakash. And that's why the serpent is called that in Genesis 3. Well, Nachash in Hebrew is both a noun and a verb. And it's a noun, as I said here, meaning snake, but it's also the verb meaning to attract by allurement. And actually, in this case, it means also to divine or to consult the dark world. And the fact that Laban used the word Nachash to describe the source of his information, it shows that Laban was in communication with the dark world through divination, through witchcraft. And Nachash, that's popular today. That's popular. Every time you see a sign, you're driving down, you see a sign, psychic services. That's a place where Nachash is used to consult the dark world. And Laban consulted the dark world with these images that he had that are referred to in the next chapter in verse 19, when it says Laban went in to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. See, those were the images that he used to Nachash, to consult the dark world. Well, Haran was a place of witchcraft. It's no wonder that God wanted Jacob out of there. And so now Laban, he tries this one, and then he goes on. He's got another persuasion, and he says, "Oh, look, I'll make you a promise. I'll make you a promise." In verse 28, he says, "I'll make you a promise, Jacob." He says, "You choose the wages, I'll give it. Appoint me thy wages, and I will give it." Literally, in the Hebrew, in verse 28, what Laban says is, "Your wages be on me. It's on me." You know, it's just like he walks into the restaurant. It's on me, you know. He says, it's on me. In other words, I will personally bear the burden of your wages. You name it, I'll pay it. And so Laban is saying to Jacob, fix your terms, fix the terms of the agreement. I'm telling you right now, I'll agree to it. I mean, who makes such an offer like that, you know? Who makes such an offer of agreeing to terms he's never heard of yet? You know, if we did it at Scantibodies, we said to our customers in negotiations, look, we just want to tell you we're coming in this negotiation, but we agree to the terms before we even hear what they are. So if we did that, we'd be out of business. You know, why do you think Laban made that offer to Jacob? Why do you think that Laban made the offer to agree to terms before he even heard what the terms were? Why do you think he did that? I know he wanted to persuade him, but what was he thinking, Laban? Come up with such a thing like that. Well, maybe. It's one possibility. He had no intention. Yeah, he had no intention of giving Rachel after 7 years. That's probably. But, you know, he'd also seen by experience that Jacob, because he'd seen how Jacob had offered to work 7 years for Rachel, Laban knew that Jacob's terms would actually cost Laban very little. And because of this was his strategy with Laban. This was also kind of a Nachash strategy of luring Jacob in close to within striking range. And Jacob had seen Laban used this strategy in the past with the agreement for getting Rachel as his wife, because he had said in the previous chapter, verse 15, Genesis 29:15, Laban said unto Jacob, because thou art my brother, shouldst thou therefore serve me for naught? Tell me, what shall thy wages be? So Laban's used this before, and when Jacob hears this, he says, I heard that before. He says, I remember that. Probably didn't have the intention of ever fulfilling it. But only this time, little buddy boy Jacob, he's ready for Laban. And Jacob has thought this through already. And now he's got in mind to trap Laban. So now it's Jacob's turn to set the stage. And so he says in verse 29, thou knowest how I have served thee. See, notice he doesn't start by telling Laban what he has done while working for Laban, but he starts by calling Laban's attention to how he's worked for Laban. So he doesn't start with what of his service, what he accomplished, but he starts with how. And because Jacob says that the how of his service is described as one simple phrase. He said, the how was thy cattle was with me. Thy cattle was with me. It's very important because it describes to us how Jacob worked with Laban's herd. See, what Jacob was saying that he wasn't just an 8-to-5 employee, of Laban, who went to the flocks that he had to, and he really didn't care. He says, well, whatever happens after 5, that's chance. But, I work 8 to 5. But he says, no, he says, the how I served you in verse 20 was, thy cattle was with me. See, he was saying that he viewed Laban's cattle like almost like his whole family, like they were his own. He lived with Laban's cattle. Laban's cattle were with Jacob. And in the next chapter, sort of expanding on what he is saying here, in the next chapter, when Jacob then explains to his wives how he worked for Laban, their father, Jacob will say in Genesis 31:6, ye know that with all my power I have served your father. So these statements in verse 29, thy cattle was with me, and Genesis 31:6, with all my power I have served, they build for us a picture of the kind of worker that Jacob was for Laban. They also build a picture of the kind of worker that God wants us to be. There's a phrase in the Bible that's used as a warning, and it describes the kind of employees we should be and we should not be. And it's used in Ephesians 6:5-7. Ephesians 6:5-7. It says, servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and tremble. And here's a phrase, in singleness of heart as unto Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with goodwill, doing service to the Lord, not to men. And then the same statement is picked up in Colossians 3:22, where it says, servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. See, that's the phrase. Not with eye service as men pleasers. That's the warning. But instead, singleness of heart, like serving Christ. That's how the encouragement. We're told to serve with singleness of heart as unto Christ. To see work as being given to us by the Lord Jesus, and to work as unto him. That was Jacob. So Jacob describes, first of all, this how of his work for Laban. Thy cattle was with me. And now he goes on to describe the what, the next part, the what, or the results, in verse 30. For it was little, which thou hast before I came, and now increased unto a multitude, and the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming. Okay? Blessed me since thy coming. See, Jacob has he's now looking at the results of his work, and he describes it as, it is now increased unto a multitude. See those words, increased unto a multitude, are one Hebrew word, paratz. It's used in Proverbs 3:10, where it says, so shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. See, the presses shall burst out, paratz, with new wine. That's a picture of breaking forward, of not being able to contain it, an explosion of new wine. And Jacob's saying, this is what's happened. This is what happened since I came. The cattle has just paratz. They've broken forth in such an increase. But Jacob is careful to give God the glory, as he doesn't say, I did it all, and God had nothing to do with it. See, Jacob is saying that, yes, he did put all of his power into it, but it was the Lord that blessed to make it all happen. That's very important the way he put that, because the way Jacob has put that in verse 30, it's a beautiful mixture of God's blessing with human effort. When Jacob says, the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming. See, when it says since my coming, literally in the Hebrew, he said, at my foot. See, the Lord has blessed thee at my foot, or with my foot. It means the diligent work that he did. And it's a phrase, at my foot, with my foot, is a phrase which is used to describe hard work. As a matter of fact, it's a phrase that Moses used to describe to the Jewish people what they did in Egypt. And it says in Deuteronomy 11:10, Moses said, for the land whither thou goest in to possess it is not as the land of Egypt, and now he's going to describe the land of Egypt, from whence ye came out, where thou sowest thy seed and waterest it with thy foot. A garden of herbs. So that was in other words, he was saying to Israel, he said, look, the land of Canaan is going to be much easier for you, much less work for you compared where you're not going to have to water the seed with your foot, such hard work. Well, Jacob says that the Lord blessed Laban with Jacob's foot since his coming, with his foot. In other words, he put in a lot of work and God blessed. But Jacob had to put in a lot of work in order for God to bless. As it says in Psalm 127:1, which is actually Solomon's song. Talk about a person who did a lot of work. And Solomon said, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. See, we labor to build, but in the end, we look to the Lord to bless. And that's the balance between work and God's blessing. And that's the beauty of the phrase in verse 30, the Lord hath blessed thee at my foot. Or my coming. All right. Now, so Jacob, he's learned to play the same game that Jacob has played with him. And so he's got, Jacob has fixed Laban's attention on all that Laban has gained by Jacob coming. See, and now Jacob's luring Laban in. And now he comes up and says, oh, but I have a little problem. At the end of verse 30, he says, now when shall I provide for mine own house also? In other words, verse 30, Jacob is saying he's asking Laban, when? I've been spending 14 years here, but now when's my time? And he's telling Laban that he has nothing to show for all the time he's worked for Laban. And if he spends more time working for Laban, when? Jacob says, well, he have time to provide for his own family, see? So Laban, now, he still avoids making any offer to Jacob. He's waiting for Jacob to fix the terms for his continued service. In verse 31, he says, what shall I give thee? And that's exactly where Jacob wants to have Laban. He's kind of like salivating, And so this is a real cat and mouse game here. This is a cat and mouse negotiation where Jacob is thinking, he has Laban because Laban is asking, what shall I give thee? He's really wanting. And Laban is thinking that he has Jacob. because Jacob has talked about his need to provide for his own house. So it's gotten intense, and both parties are just eyeing each other. And now it's time for Jacob to make his move. So Jacob makes his move with the introduction to his proposal in verse 31, where he says, "Thou shalt not give me anything." Boy, he's learned how to negotiate with Laban. See, Jacob has learned that the only person Laban cares about is Laban. And so he's choosing his words that are really pushing Laban's happiness button. He said those words, and Laban, when he said, "Thou shalt not give me anything," Laban lit up with a smile. He thought, "Oh, wow. Now that's what I like to hear," Laban's thinking, I like to hear that I don't have to give anything to Jacob. And so now, Jacob, he's got the hook set now in Laban. He's telling Laban, "I don't want anything from you, because since God has blessed you." And so he's telling him, what Jacob is telling Laban is that, Laban, old pal, buddy, you can just keep all that God has blessed you with. I don't want any part of that, And he makes this provision in verse 30, if thou wilt do this thing for me. He's really drawing him in. What is it? What is it? And so at the end of verse 31, he says, if you do this thing for me, I will, it says in the English here, I will again feed and keep thy flock. Now, the way that Jacob has said that in the Hebrew is like, it could have been Shakespeare that said that. It's so rhythmic. It's so elegant. It's so beautiful, because all he does is he just says three words. And there's just a simple elegance to the way he says these three words. Return, so that's what they meant by, again, return, feed, guard. And that's what Jacob says. It's beautifully written. Shub ra'ah shamar. That's what he says. Return, feed, guard. Shub ra'ah shamar. And so it's almost as beautiful as day unto day and night unto night, the way he says it. But he says, I will return, I will feed, I will guard. So now he's using some poetry here, poetic style here, to really draw Laban in. He's going, oh, that's so good. So Jacob is promised now to stay, to return, because he says, like, I'm already halfway out the door, but I'll turn around, I'll return, and I'll feed, and I'll guard your flocks, and I'll give you your flocks just like I did in the past if you agree to my plan. Okay? And so he says, okay, here's his plan. So he says in verse 32 to 33 is his plan. He says, I will pass through all thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled, little like salt and peppered, and spotted, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and of such shall be my hire. So shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come from my hire before thy face. Everyone that's not speckled, or not spotted among the goats, and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. In other words, what did he just say? That's the thing, what did maybe Laban was, no, Laban, he understood immediately what he was saying, but we don't understand. So what has Jacob proposed to Laban? Well, first, we need to understand in this proposal, even though it's stated here, that how long Jacob agreed to stay with Laban and take care of his flocks. Not stated here, but you look in the next chapter in verse 41 and you tell me, how long did Jacob stay with Laban? Total of, but from this point on. How much extra time?
20 years.
How much extra time?
Another.
That's it, 6, because 14 plus 6 is 20. So, isn't that right? Yeah, that's right. 14 plus 6 is 20. Last time I checked it was. I have a calculator. Anyway, it's 6 more years. So he's proposing 6 years. Okay, now, we got the time in our mind, 6 years. Now, there are 2 parts to his proposal. You see, now, first of all, in the understanding of his proposal, we need to understand, in the Middle East, goats are black. Goats are not white in the Middle East. That's Scandinavia. Those are Saanen goats. Goats are black in the Middle East. Okay, they're black, and virtually all the goats are black, and the sheep are white. Sheep are white here, sheep are white in the Middle East. That part we get. Okay, so virtually all of the sheep are white, virtually all of the goats are black. It's extremely rare to find a brown or a salt and peppered speckled or a spotted sheep. That's like unheard of. It's extremely rare to find goats in the Middle East that are not that are spotted or speckled. Okay? And among Laban's flock, there were very, very few of these sheep that were not white. And so we'll call them the non-white sheep. It's easier than saying spotted and speckled, non-white anyway. But they didn't do it that way, so it doesn't matter. And of those goats, it's very rare to find the goats that were not black. So those goats we'll call non-black goats. So Jacob said that his hire, that what he wanted for taking care of Laban's flocks, is going to have two parts. And in verse 32 is the first part of the proposal. Verse 33 is the second part. So verse 32, the first part of his proposal, is that he would immediately go through the flock and he would gather up this infinitesimally small number of goats that were not black and a very small number of sheep that were not white. You know, those were the odd goats and sheep that would immediately be removed from Laban's herds, and those would belong to Jacob. I'm sure Laban thought of that. He says, well, that's 1 week of meals for you, but that's nothing. It's fine. That's wonderful. And then he says in verse 33, the second part of Jacob's proposal was that after all the non-black sheep were removed from Laban's herds, that any non-black sheep which happened to be born, would I say it wrong? Non-black goats. That any non-black goat, am I just saying sheep? I got sheep on my mind, I'm sorry. If there were any non-black goats that happened to be born from Laban's herd of black goats, those would immediately be culled from Laban's flocks, and those also would belong to Jacob. See, that was the deal. And after all those non-white sheep were removed from Laban's herd, that any non-white sheep that happened to be born from Laban's herd of white sheep, those also would be immediately culled from Laban's flock there, and those would belong to Laban. So do you understand what the proposal is? It took us a long time to describe it. It didn't take Laban but a second to understand all this. And of course, any offspring from Jacob's small herd of non-black goats and non-white sheep, those will belong to Jacob also. So okay, very small. So Jacob agrees to take care of Laban's herds for an additional 6 years if Laban agrees to give Jacob these extremely rare non-black goats and non-white sheep. See, that's Jacob's offer. That's his offer. And he'll stay for 6 more years, and he'll return, he'll feed, he'll guard, he'll take care, in other words, of Laban's herds. And then, he makes this proposal, lays it on the table, and then Jacob turns to Laban and says, deal or no deal? And Laban is thinking, boy, let me get this straight. Now he's thinking to himself, there are practically no non-black goats and no non-white sheep in my herds. And if the non-black goats are removed from my herds, then there will certainly be no non-black goats born to black goats. He's very intelligent, this Laban. And if the non-white sheeps are removed from my herds, and there will certainly be no non-white sheeps born to my white sheep. So you're saying that all you want for 6 more years of labor is that this small number of non-black goats and non-white sheep, which is and for certain the zero number of non-black goats that are going to be born to black goats and non-white sheep that are going to be born to white sheep. That's your proposal? He says, boy, a sucker is born every day. He's thinking that, And so Laban, he jumps on that in verse 34. And Laban says, behold, I would it might be according to thy word. In other words, he's saying, deal, deal, deal. Just the way you said it. No modifications. Let's seal the deal. He's jumping. And Laban is thinking to himself, boy, he's just made out like a bandit. He says he can't believe the deal he just got from Jacob. Laban is thinking that maybe a goat hit his head or the sun was too hot for him out there or something to make a thing like that. What's he thinking? But Laban is thinking, I get 6 more years of Jacob's labor there for these small number of animals, and of course the solid colors will never yield anything but solid colored animals. I mean, everyone knows that. Jacob's a loser. I always knew he was a loser. He's a loser. And he's talking like Donald Trump now, see? And he says, I will get 6 more years for nothing. That's what Laban's saying. Now that's what Laban is thinking. But now the question is, what is Jacob thinking? Well, the key to Jacob's thinking is found in verse 30, which we already covered, when he said, the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming or at my foot. See, Jacob knows he's poured himself into working for Laban. And Jacob's not just saying, Jacob's not the kind of person who walks around and say, oh, God bless you, God bless you, God bless you. He's not thinking. What does he mean by God bless you or God blessed you? Or he's saying, he means it when he says, the Lord hath blessed thee. I worked really hard for you, but the Lord hath blessed thee. And Jacob's thinking to himself, I know that Lord that blessed you, and that was the Lord that told me that he was going to, I was going to have a lot of children, and my family was going to continue, and that means I got to have. I got to have. So he's saying, the Lord has blessed thee, and he's thinking in his mind, the Lord is going to bless me. There's no question in Jacob's mind where the increase in Laban's flocks came from. Jacob knows it came from the Lord. And this thought that Laban's blessing has come from the Lord has so captivated Jacob's mind that Jacob has put his confidence or his trust in the Lord and not in Laban, which is exactly what King David said in Psalm 118, verse 8. Psalm 118, verse 8 says, it's better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. And for the word trust, King David has used the word chasa. Chasa is a Hebrew word, and it's a picture word. And the word chasa is the picture of a person fleeing for protection. It means to run for protection. And so Jacob, that's what he's doing here. He needs protection. He needs protection from Laban. But he needs protection also to have enough to provide for his family. And so as Jacob is making this proposal to Laban, which is way slanted toward Laban, Jacob is running to the Lord for protection, and he's trusting that the Lord's going to help him. See, Jacob is trusting the Lord for help to build up his own flocks. But what is Jacob thinking will be the opportunity to build up his flocks? Most of you know me as living in El Cajon in civilization. I live in civilization. I don't have any animals, just fish. I won't have any animals except fish. There's a reason for that. Because there was a time in my life when I didn't live in civilization, and I lived in Lakeside. Lakeside's an uncivilized place, especially. Well, there's 2 parts of Willow Road. I lived on Willow Road. So there's 2 parts. There's the civilized part of Willow Road, and you go from Highway 67, you turn down Willow Road, through that Wildcat Canyon, that's civilized. There's paved streets. Paved streets means civilization. But when I lived I lived down the 3 miles down the other side, of Willow Road, the uncivilized part, and surrounded by 300 goats and sheep. And I raised them and cared for them and made antibodies in them. And we still, Scanibody still has hundreds of goats and some sheep up in Ramona. And so, I go up there once in a while and I look at them, and they understand, and I understand, I look at them, that we have a love-hate relationship between my goats and sheep because of those 10 years. But it taught me a lot about goats and sheep in those 10 years. It taught me so much that the only animals I want are fish. Anyhow, that's the reason why I'm worth my salt as a Bible teacher, because I know about goats and sheep, see? So anyhow, goats and sheep have a gestation of about 5 months. It takes about 5 months. So it's possible, and you can get from goats and sheep, you can get two births twice a year. They can throw twice a year, which means that goats and sheep they'll throw in the early spring, and they'll throw in the early fall, and then they come back into heat. It doesn't take long to breed again in the middle to late spring, and back in the middle to late fall. But the kids and the lambs that are born in the spring are stronger than the kids and the lambs that are born in the fall. Those are the ones that come from the fall breeding, those stronger ones. So goats of the open, like what we're talking about here with Jacob here and Laban, they only live about 8 to 10 years. Goats die after about 8 to 10 years. They die because they lose their teeth. So if you don't want to die, don't lose your teeth. Our goats live about 12 to 14 years. But that's because we're constantly mouthing our goats and seeing when their teeth fall out, and they have other problems too. And then we have hospital pens for our goats, and we also have our old goats home where we feed them with high protein paste. Ensure. So, but in Jacob's day, goats and sheep lived about 8 to 10 years. So what's important to see with this is about what Jacob's got in his mind when he realizes and he's thinking, 6 years. I've got 6 years. Now he's got the opportunity within 6 years to get 2 births per year. So in the 6 years, he's got an opportunity for 12 births. And the other point to realize about goats and sheep is they don't start breeding, or you shouldn't start breeding, until they're about 10 to 12 months old, and about a year. And these goats, you get about 7 years of breeding out of a goat like this until about 8 years old, and then they're done. So during the 6 years that Jacob's opportunities here to build his herd, virtually all of the breeding life, or virtually all the actual life of Laban's animals will be spent during this time, the 6 years. So virtually all the animals that will be left at the end of the 6 years will be from the new goats that come from the goats that he has now at the start of the 6-year project, see? So Laban is thinking that all of the goats and the sheep that are going to come at the end of the 6-year project will be black goats and white sheep, because he's going to remove all the non-black goats, the non-white sheep are going to be removed. And everybody knows, black goats make black sheep make white sheep. But Jacob, he's thinking, he's run to God, and he's trusting in God. So that he's thinking all those black goats are going to make non-black goats, and all those white sheep are going to make non-white sheep. See? So you look carefully at verse 33, because in the first part of verse 33, Jacob is talking about a what, and then Jacob is talking about a when, and then Jacob is talking about a where. See? So when you look at that, first Jacob said there is a what in the first part of verse 30. What does Jacob say will answer for him? What will answer for him? My righteousness. See, that's the what. My righteousness is going to answer. Then second, Jacob is saying when. So in that first part of verse 33, when did Jacob say his righteousness is going to answer for him? Say it again. Sorry, Jose. Yeah, time to come. When it shall come for his hire in the time to come, which would come obviously at the end of the 6 years. And third, Jacob is saying where. See, so in the first part of verse 33, where did Jacob say his righteousness would answer for him? Before thy face. Right in the face of Jacob, Laban. So now, what is the what? Righteousness. When is the when at the time of my hire? Where is the where? It's in Jacob's face. It's Laban's face. That's what Jacob's talking about. So first, for the what righteousness, Jacob is talking about, when he says righteousness, what is right. So by saying the word righteousness, Jacob is saying to Laban, I want to talk to you, Laban, about what is right. It's not right that I've just worked for you for an extra 7 years and got nothing for it. That's not right. I agreed to work the first 7 years for you in order to get Rachel, but I had to work another 7 years for you to get Rachel. That means it wasn't right for me to work that additional 7 years and get nothing. You owe me for those additional 7 years. See, that's the righteousness part. He says, so when Jacob is saying to Laban, he's saying like this. By Jacob saying, when it shall come for my hire, Jacob is saying, at the end of the 6-year project, God's going to make the wrong right. And again, the wrong will be set right, and that wrong is going to be the 7 years of labor with no pay that you, Laban, have extracted from me. And third, he says, where? Jacob is saying, maybe this part he loved the most, I don't know. Jacob is saying, in your face. He's saying that, he says, the set is going to be made wrong in your face, and you won't be able to avoid seeing that God set the wrong right. Okay, now what happened during these 6 years? Well, goats can give birth to as little as 1 kid per birth, and to as many as 3 kids per birth. The average is 2. But sometimes the goats, we had goats, they can give 5 kids. You've seen that. So let's give an average of 2, the standard average, 2 kids per birth. Maybe it was 3, I don't know. But during these 6 years, since they throw twice per year, that means the herd grew 4-fold each year. And after 6 years, that means the herd would grow 24-fold. 24-fold. Now, we have to pick a number that Laban's herd was at the start of the project. And we know that Jacob said when he first came, it was little, it was small. Well, how little was it? Well, Rachel was taking care of it. Somehow I just don't get the idea that Rachel is a big he-man, but anyway. So she alone is taking care of Laban's flock. So let's say that, pretty young Rachel, maybe she's got 20 goats and sheep, that she's got there. And after 14 years, how many has he got? Well, I don't know, but, I always thought in Lakeside when you had 300 goats, that was a lot. So let's give him 300. So he's got, 300. And, so let's say that Laban's herd started out with at this time with 300 goats. That means that after 6 years, those 300 goats could grow 24-fold to over 7,000 goats. That's really a lot, especially under God's blessing if each female threw more than the average 2 per birth. So and let's say that of those 300 starting goats, that maybe there were 5%, and I think that's a really high figure, but let's say that maybe 5% that were non-black goats and non-white sheep. That's 15 animals. So Laban starts out, and he says, 15 animals? That's nothing, we'll take care of them. Okay, so Laban starts out taking care of Jacob's measly little 15 animals, while Jacob starts out taking care of Laban's, let's say, 300 animals. Now, during this 6-year time, Jacob's 15 animals that he starts off taking care of, they grow, let's say they do grow 24 times. So now they're 360. So all of a sudden Laban's got 360. But every non-black goat and every non-black sheep that's born that's born in Laban's herd, those immediately are taken out because he doesn't want them in there. Laban doesn't. Taken out, and they go over to Laban to take care of. No, Jacob is taking care of Laban's flock. And so every non-black goat and non-white sheep that are born under Jacob's care, that are Laban's flock, okay? I haven't confused you. I think I confused myself, but anyway. They got to get out of that herd because Laban doesn't want them there. So they go over to Laban's side. This is Laban's flocks. Jacob is taking care of Laban's flocks. They are on Jacob's side. Oh, I see what the problem is. Doesn't matter. All right, so you understand, so I don't have to say anymore. All right, so at the end of 6 years, Jacob now, he gives to Laban his original all-black goats and all-white sheep. And what are they? They're worn out. They're ready to die. They're old goats. And And what happens? Jacob now, he collects his hire. Jacob collects his hire that Laban's taking care of. It's like 7,000 maybe non-black goats and non-white sheep, which he's probably got all the people in the all the people in the area coming around like a circus to see all these non-black goats. And anyway, so that's what happens at the end of 6 years. See, he starts, Laban says, all I got to take care of is 15. That's nothing, And he's got 300 here. And at the end, he's got 300 practically dead animals, and he's got 7,000 he's taking care of for the other guy. That's a real issue. So this is a fulfillment of 1 Samuel 26:23. The Lord rendered to every man his righteousness and his faithfulness. And Psalm 37, 5 through 8. Psalm 37, 5 through 8. Commit thy way, Jacob, unto the Lord. Trust also in him. He shall bring it to pass. He shall bring forth thy righteousness as the light, and thy judgment as the noonday. Rest in the Lord. Wait patiently for him. Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in the way, in the process, that'd be Laban, because of the man who bringeth wicked devices to pass, that'd be Laban. Cease from anger, that'd be Jacob. Forsake wrath, that'd be Jacob. Fret not thyself in any wise to do evil. Okay? And so this is what Jacob has done. And the key to Jacob's being able to do this are the words that he says in verse 33, in time to come, in time to come. See, when Jacob said in time to come, Jacob was saying that in time to come, we'll be able to look back and we'll be able to see what God did. And that phrase, in time to come, is important. And God wants us to always look back. It means look back and see. That's what he said in the book of Exodus, where he gave this feast of unleavened bread in Exodus 13:7. Exodus 13:7. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and there shall be no leavened bread seen with thee, neither shall there be leaven seen with thee in all thy quarters. And thou shalt show thy son in that day, saying, this is done because of that which the Lord did unto me when I came forth out of Egypt. And then in verse 14, Exodus 13:14, and it shall come to pass, and it shall be, when thy son asketh thee in time to come, and shall say unto him, what is this? He's going to say, the son's going to, what is this? Thou shalt say unto him, by strength of hand, the Lord brought us out from Egypt, from the house of bondage. See, God instituted these feasts, like the Feast of Unleavened Bread, with the intention of raising questions. Like the question the child's going to ask the parents, why do we do these things? And God says, when those times comes, those are your in time to come times, and that's the chance you need to explain to the child what God did. So how do we preserve the value of in time to come? By repeating what God has done in the past from the accounts of our own lives and from the Bible accounts. That keeps fresh in our minds what God has done. Well, this is what Jacob is saying to Laban, that there will be an in time to come, when we'll all be able to look back and we'll see the wondrous works of God. So that's very valuable to do. That's a whole psalm is dedicated to that in Psalm 136. Psalm 136, it just captures the whole benefit of the in time to come. David looks back over time. He recounts everything God did. He starts in creation. He goes to the deliverance in Egypt over and over, and he keeps saying, his mercy endureth forever. His mercy endureth forever. Well, in verse 34, Jacob says, so shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come. And what was seen as you look back, so we talked about it. Start off with a large herd of 300 strong, healthy goats and sheep that belonged to Laban. And Jacob's taking care of them. And at the end of the 6 years, you see a weak, old, worn-out herd of less than 300 goats and sheep. They belong to Laban, and Jacob is still taking care of it. And you saw over here a strong, healthy herd of maybe 7,000 goats and sheep that belonged to Jacob, that Laban was taking care of for Jacob. See, Laban was doing all that work. So at the end of 7 years, you saw in time to come what happened. And that's what Jacob told Laban's daughters, his wives, happened. in chapter 31, verse 9. Chapter 31, verse 9, where he said, "Thus God hath taken away the cattle of your father and given them to me." That's what happened. So at the end of the 6 years, you saw this in time to come happen to Laban. And Jacob was just like what happened to the murderous Haman and his intended victim Mordecai in time to come. We already studied in Esther 6:11, in Esther 6:11, when it says, "Then took Haman the apparel and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and brought him on horseback through the street of the city and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor." So what we see happened in time to come was Jacob starting with nothing and becoming rich. And Jacob needed goats and sheep to become rich. Jacob needed goats and sheep, and Jacob knew it took, see, Jacob's also very intelligent. Jacob knew it took goats and sheep to make goats and sheep. And he didn't have any goats and sheep. Eh? Great intelligence. You can't make goats and sheep without goats and sheep. And Jacob didn't have any goats and sheep. And so Jacob borrowed Laban's goats and sheep to make his own goats and sheep. Jacob became rich because of the goats and sheep that he borrowed from Laban. What did the children of Israel do when they left Egypt?
They took everything.
They borrowed. Can I borrow? Yes, that's nice. Can I borrow? You sure? You're the one responsible for the flies and the frogs that you take. Yeah. So Jacob became rich because of the goats and sheep that he borrowed from Laban. Now, I personally understand this because this was in time to come. You know, Jacob had nothing. He had no goats and sheep. Jacob borrowed Laban's goats and sheep. Jacob became rich from Laban's goats and sheep that he borrowed. I personally understand this because the same thing happened to me. That's what happened to me. You know, in 1976, Dr. Phil Scarpace and I decided to start a company to make antibodies in goats. So Scarpace Cantor antibodies became Scantibodies. But we had no money. In fact, all we could invest to start the company was $65 a piece, which made $130. And I really didn't even have that. And so when I told the chapel in here in this room that I was starting a company, an old widow lady came up to me right by those donation boxes back there, and she gave me a $100 bill, which I later used to buy Phil out, form the company, so it only cost me $30. But Phil and I started with $130, and first we went to Cal Biochem in La Jolla, and we bought the antigen that we needed to inject the goats with, which was rabbit gamma globulin, and it wasn't too bad. It cost $25. But then we had anticipated that how much the pharmacy was going to ask for the box of syringes and needles, that cost $90. So that left us with $15. And I told Phil, I said, Phil, about our project to make goat anti-rabbit gamma globulin, I know that you're the PhD in the organization, but we're missing a key component, and I'll give you a hint, it has 4 legs. And we can't buy a goat for $15. And so we couldn't make our product without goats. And Jacob doesn't have any goats. I feel like I was Jacob. Jacob had no money to buy the goats, just like me. So I was looking at the newspaper, and I saw that there was a Harbison Canyon feed store. I didn't even know that there was a place called Harbison Canyon, much less a feed store. And every Saturday morning, they had an auction that included animals. So I said to Phil, let's go. And Phil said, why? I said, I don't know, but we'll find out when we get there. So the auction starts off, and there's furniture's being auctioned off, and then ducks come in there, pigs, rabbits, and then came the goats. And I told Phil, look at who's buying goats and who's selling goats, because they were all wearing coveralls, which we weren't. Anyway, so we approached them, and we said, so what are you doing with the goats? And they said, oh, don't you? He said, the Filipinos, they love to barbecue goats. So we buy them for $40, and they eat the weeds for about 6 months, and then we sell them for $60. And I said, so after 6 months, you're making $20. Yeah, they said. I said, so you're making about $3 a month. Yeah. And they said, that's right, about $3 per month. And so then I spun a spiel. I said, I got serious looking, and I said, look, we're from the university. As a matter of fact, he's a PhD, and we have a project. So now I said, if you let us borrow your goats, we'll come and we'll inject your goats with our antigen. We won't hurt them. They won't die. And then after they start making antibodies, we'll bleed them every month and give you $5 for every bleed, or $5 a month. So instead of you making $3 a month for just 6 months, we'll give you $5 a month continuously. All you have to do is let us borrow your goats. And at the end of the day, we had 165 borrowed goats signed up for our business, and it didn't cost us anything. Okay? Jacob got rich on borrowed goats. I got rich on borrowed goats. How did Jacob get rich on borrowed goats and sheep? I don't count sheep. I don't like sheep. But anyway, I'll just talk about the goats. But anyway, how did Jacob get rich on borrowed goats? Because God blessed Jacob's work. How did I get rich on borrowed goats? Because God blessed the work. Now in verse 34, Laban jumps on it and he says, behold, I would it might be, he says, behold, I would it might be. See, Jacob is thinking of how this again was a great opportunity for Laban. Laban is thinking that. Laban is thinking this is a great opportunity again for himself to defraud Jacob, because it's not a fair proposal. And had Laban been honest, he would have represented to Jacob, you're going to be the great loser in this bargain. But he's not honest. So the only concern that Laban had was that Jacob's going to realize, oh, that's a bad deal, and back out before he can make the agreement. So in verse 34, it's a quick response. And Laban quickly says, behold, I would it might be according to thy word. He's thinking there's no way I can lose in this deal. Now, Jacob made the proposal in verses 32 to 33. And in verse 32, who did Jacob say would pass through the flock to remove the non-black goats and the non-white sheep? Who did Jacob say? Verse 32. Yeah, right. I will pass, meaning him, Jacob. Jacob proposed that Jacob would remove the non-black sheep and the non-white non-black sheep and the non-black goats and the non-white sheep. Now, from verse 34, who did Laban agree would pass through and remove all the non-black goats and the non-white sheep? Yeah, he said, I would it might be according to thy word. You said you're going to remove them. I want you to remove them. That means that Laban agreed that Jacob was going to do the work of passing through and removing all the non-black goats and the non-white sheep. But from verse 35, who actually did pass through the flocks to remove the non-black goats and the non-white sheep? Think so? Look at it real carefully. Verse 35. Look at the context, though. When you look at verse 35 there. Verse 35, he removed that day the he-goats that were ring-streaked, spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown among the sheep, and gave them into the hand of his sons. And he set 3 days' journey betwixt himself and Jacob. He can't be Jacob, because he set the distance between himself and Jacob. So who's the he got to be? It's got to be Laban. Laban is the one who did that. Laban is the one who went in there, even though Jacob said, I'll do it, and Laban says, yes, you do it. When it came down to it, Laban did it. Why? Why did that happen? Why did Laban remove the animals? He didn't trust Jacob. He clearly did not trust Jacob. You can just see Laban saying, I'm going to make sure. I'm going to make sure. I don't trust this guy, Jacob. I'm going to make sure he doesn't get any goats or sheep that are not black goats and non-white sheep. By hiding them, somehow there's going to be these non-black goats and these non-white sheep, and I don't want Jacob to get one goat or one sheep. So I'm not going to trust him to remove those animals. Out of my way, Jacob. I'm going to check and remove the animals myself. That's Laban. And you can see just how careful Laban was when it says in verse 35, and everyone that had some white in it. You get a magnifying glass out, Laban. You see any white? Get it out of there. He culled those things. Make sure there's just no possibility for Jacob to get any animals at all. That's Laban. That's the Laban that Jacob's working for. So, Laban, having removed the animals himself, who did Laban give the removed animals to? His sons. His sons, Verse 35, it says, and he gave them into the hands of his sons. Well, Jacob's got 11 sons there. There's 11 boys sitting around doing nothing. So why not say, guys, get in here. Let's do some help here. See, Did Jacob give the removed, did he give the removed animals into the hands of Jacob? Did Laban give the removed animals into Jacob? No, because he didn't trust Jacob's sons. So Laban gives the removed animals to his own sons and tells them, now you make sure that these removed animals stay away from those other animals. I don't want any breeding going on between them. Now from verse 36, he did a further precaution. That Laban makes sure that there'd be no breeding between the removed animals and the herd. What was it? 3 days journey. 3 days journey separates them. That reminds me of a Jewish sales lady we had working for us in New York. She looked Italian. It was always like, you sure you're Jewish? And she said her people came from Germany near the Italian border, and she always said, someone jumped the fence at night. Well, in verse 36, Laban was going to make sure no goat or sheep jumped the fence at night. Because Laban set a distance of 3 days' journey between his herd that Jacob had and Jacob's herd. The animals Jacob was taking care of. Now, can you imagine how during those 6 years there would arrive to Laban from Jacob more and more non-black goats and non-white sheep. And these were Jacob's animals. And Laban had to take care of them. I mean, he must have been saying, where are these animals coming from? This must have killed this must have killed Laban as he thought, wait, I was the one who removed those non-black goats and non-white sheep from my herd. How could my herd be producing all these non-black goats and these non-white sheep? This was a killer for him. Now, the new agreement has been made, and the new deal has been sealed, and 6 years starts from now. And that starts from the end of verse 36, where it says, and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. There's a particular sadness to that last statement in verse 36. Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. There's in that statement a sadness that things are just going to continue as they have been. There's a sadness, they're returning to the old miserable life as before. Nothing's going to change. There's an application in that. For us, the application is, when we sigh and return to the old situation of failed health, an unhappy job, an unhappy marriage, and God says, just wait, because things are going to change for you, Jacob. And there are times in our lives when we run into our verse 36, Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. And God says, just wait. There's a last verse in this chapter, verse 43, and the man increased exceedingly and had much cattle and maidservants and menservants, camels and asses. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for being Jacob's God and helping him. And then thank you for calling yourself to us the God of Jacob. In Jesus' name, amen.